Good evening and welcome to 50 Days, the American election show where we spend the last remaining month analysing key aspects of the presidential election with only 50 days to go. I'm Ben Cook.
And I'm Jess Blissitt. Today we'll be joined in the studio by Salford academic Kristen Blackstone to discuss candidate personas in American presidents throughout the years.
Then after that, you'll see how earlier this week, Caitlin and I spoke to local students about their opinions on Kamala and Trump, looking at what conclusions people have come to from across the pond.
After that, I spoke to American academic Kate Feld this week to discuss voting turnout and which demographics are less likely to turn up at polling booths this November.
But for now, let's go to Rosa, who's going to talk us through the statistical analysis of the swing states and why the results are really up for grabs this year. Rosa.
Thanks, Jess and Ben. So, we're back and it's been another big week in American politics. Later on in the show, Jess, Ben and Caitlin are going to delve deeper into the vice presidential debate. But before they do, let's take a really quick look at the stats. So, first up, we got a CBS YouGov Snap poll. So this is taken from viewers of the debate directly afterwards, so we get their instinct before they've had the time to be influenced by other people. So overall, it does seem JD Vance won the debate, but only by a single percentage point. This is really good for Vance because he was going into this with a series of gaffes behind him and a really low likability score. However, it's also somewhat expected as he did go to Yale, he's well practiced in debate, and crucially, he's been interviewed lots over the election, so that's really, really good debate prep. So next up, we've got who did a better job. So we've got abortion, pretty expected, and what's really bothering Democrats though is the economy. So it's still seeming to be Trump and Vance that they trust on the economy, and that's really troubling for Kamala, as I said last week, at a time when people are feeling poorer. So next up, we've got favourability ratings. So here we've got Tim Walz, as you can see, before the debate, fairly high favourability rating, fairly high also unfavourable rating, but we've got a huge jump to 60% after the debate. That is massive for a vice presidential candidate, and 35% unfavourable. So people like him more than they did before the debate. Interestingly, next we have Vance. He also has gone up. So it's a bit of the reverse of Tim Walz. He was more unfavourable, 54%, and 40% unfavourable. And then we've got, after the debate, 49% and 47%. So he is definitely more liked. What we see here is that people seem to like them both more after watching. And that could be a consequence of the fact that it was a less fiery, more polite debate. So, moving on. I'm going to bring you yesterday's general poll. Kamala is still ahead, but is within a margin of error. To really understand how this election's working, I think we need to talk about swing states. So this week, I will talk about Pennsylvania. In the next few weeks, I'll try and cover the rest. So what are the polls like in Pennsylvania? I've got a graph for you here, and as you can see, Biden was behind in Pennsylvania. As I said last week, it's his home state, but he wasn't doing very well. But as we hit closer to the election, we start polling more, we're seeing more fluctuation, but Kamala starts coming out on top, only just. How can she cement this lead? Because remember, Pennsylvania could be the most important state this election. It carries the most electoral points of all the swing states. So one area she's really struggling in is pensioners. So I've got a poll here from the AARP who support pensioners. And she has the youth demographic down, but as you can see, she does not have the older demographic down. We've got 53% for Trump and 44% for Harris. That really isn't good for her because, as you can see in my next slide, the troubling thing is we've got the 50 plus category far more enthusiastic about voting and far more enthusiastic about getting out there. So she might need to put a lot more work into advertising to these people. It might be that the brat marketing has possibly passed them by. So another demographic which she could put more into is the Latin Hispanic vote. The majority of Latinos in Pennsylvania are Puerto Ricans, which is interesting because that's a group which has been fairly consistently Democrat. Remember, the Latin American vote is very broad. There's a lot of different countries and the populations don't necessarily vote the same. Puerto Ricans have been traditionally loyal to the Democrats because of their strong union ties. And as you can see, they do like Kamala in Pennsylvania. When the switch was made, we've got, just after that shift, we've got a lot more Latin Americans like Kamala than we've got non-Latin Americans, especially in Pennsylvania. So that could be a really good chance for her. However, we come back to the same issue yet again of the cost of living. So I've got another graph here showing what their top issues are in the state. And right at the top, we've got cost of living, we've got inflation, got social security, economy and jobs. That is not positive for Kamala. She is a member of the present government and a Democrat. As we say, traditionally people view Republicans as being better with the economy, so she might be seen as less likely to be helpful in the economy. So, next slide, we've got this here. This could be a really interesting way of Kamala gaining the vote in Latin America, in the Latin American population, might I say. We've got voting by mail-in ballot, and then we've got the same translation in Spanish. If she can funnel a lot of money into making sure that her ads are in Spanish, that people are going out and speaking in Spanish, that people are door knocking in Spanish, that could win her the Puerto Rican, Latin American vote in Pennsylvania, and in turn could win her the state. And that would win her the election. So there's still a lot to play for. I will talk more about other swing states next week, but thank you very much, and it's back over to you, Jess and Ben.
Thanks, Rosa. Now, joining Klaudia in the studio is Kristen Blackstone, lecturer in international and mill history, who'll be looking at patterns in American president personas throughout the years.
Having previously taught at the University of Edinburgh and Durham University, Kristen has worked at the University of Salford since 2022 and is social and military historian of early America. Together, they will be looking at whether they are historic examples of significant personalities that have swayed the public interest in former elections.
Over to you, Klaudia.
Thank you, Jess. Hello, Kristen.
Hi.
It's lovely to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So throughout history, we've seen how character and personality traits of a political candidate can significantly influence their voters, especially in this election. So speaking generally, when we take a look at Republican candidates, we share a shared focus on traditional values and economic growth. So they often adopt a more assertive communicative style, especially in comparison to their Democratic rivals, which resonates with voters who are looking for a strong leader. Democratic candidates, on the other hand, they typically emphasise policies related to social justice and inclusivity, and as such they present themselves more empathetic and more relatable to a general electorate. This empathetic approach is actually kind of a hallmark of Democratic campaigns. So, Kristen, how do you think a presidential candidate's personality traits like charisma, assertiveness, empathy, etc. impact voter decisions?
I think in the primary stage of elections, it has quite a lot to do with it when you're deciding which Republican candidate or which Democratic candidate you'd like to put forward as president, because their policies tend to be fairly similar, so personality carries a lot of weight there. I think in a presidential election, Republican versus Democrat, especially in modern times, personality only matters insofar as it leads into ability to lead the country, ability to be president. And everyone has their own opinion of what that looks like. So some people would say that it looks like someone who's incredibly assertive, who is tough, who's well-spoken. Some people would say it's someone who's more empathetic, who gets along better with people. And I think what we're seeing in this election is people's perceptions of both of the candidates' personality are they're quite divisive. They're splitting quite strongly. So I think in this election, personality will matter a bit, but only as it relates to how good they're going to be as a president.
How do you think, would you say there are historical examples where a US president's personality has significantly swayed public opinion or voter turnout?
Definitely, particularly in the charisma category of personality. So the best example, I think, is Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy went against each other in 1960. And this very famously is the first election where there's a televised debate where you have Nixon and Kennedy on the TV and viewers at home could watch them discuss things. And John F. Kennedy, of course, is younger, he's quite attractive, he's incredibly charismatic, he famously put on a little bit of makeup so he didn't look too sweaty. Richard Nixon had a cold, and he was older, and he did not come across well on TV at all. So viewers that watched them on television all unanimously said JFK was better, he was definitely the candidate they were going to vote for. Viewers that listened on the radio, in contrast, all said Richard Nixon did much better. And so it was that personality on TV and how they were able to come across that made a huge difference. And of course, JFK won that election, despite the fact that he was much younger and much less experienced than Richard Nixon. I think you saw the same with Obama in 2008. He is, of course, particularly charismatic, but one of the hallmarks of his campaign is he was a president that you could have a beer with. He was likable, he's affable, he's lovely to talk to, and that meant that people really, I think, clung on to him in his campaign, and that increased voter turnout quite significantly. Part of that, of course, is because he was the first African-American person running for president on a major ticket, but his personality, I think, really carried him through quite a lot as well.
Yeah, definitely. And more recently now, would you say that any particular personality traits have become more valued by voters in recent US elections?
Interesting. I think it's split pretty harshly across party lines. So I think for Republicans, especially Republicans that particularly favor Donald Trump, I think they really have come to appreciate someone who speaks their mind, even if it's going to get them in trouble, someone they think that they're getting the full personality on display. Whether that's true or not is debatable, but they think they are authentic, they're not part of that old school political structure, someone who's a bit different and willing to push boundaries. I think Trump, for a lot of Republicans, offers that, and that's why many of them are leaning towards him. For Democrats, it really shifts with every candidate. So as I said, Obama is obviously incredibly likable, and that worked particularly well for him. He's well-spoken, easy to speak to. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, really struggled with the likability ratings. A lot of people didn't like her. They found her too aggressive. They found her disingenuous. And so Kamala Harris, I think, has gone the opposite direction, where she's really leaning into her likability and her personality. I don't think I've ever, in my lifetime certainly, seen so many articles about a candidate's laugh. It's just constantly they're talking about her kind of big personality, her loud kind of, she throws her head back when she laughs. And I think they're really leaning into that she typifies this quite joyful, charismatic Democrat who is empathetic, but who also can be assertive when she needs to be.
How do you think the voters perceive the importance of politicians' personality traits compared to policy positions?
That's interesting. I think historically it would have been policy decisions matter a lot more than personality traits do. And personalities matter, but you had less interaction with the politician. Of course, right now people don't have one-on-one interactions with presidents very often, but on social media you think you know them a lot more. And so historically, I don't think personalities would have made as much of an opinion. They would have had some bearing, but not as much. Whereas now, in a very modern age of social media, where candidates are on TikTok and Facebook and Twitter, their personalities shine through a lot more, and I think voters have the sense that they understand the candidates better than previously. I think also because things are becoming so polarized, because Republicans and Democrats on a lot of decisions, particularly social domestic decisions, veer away from each other quite strongly, policy decisions only matter, or policy platforms really only matter in the early stages of voting. Once you have a Republican candidate and a Democratic candidate, it's quite hard to convince people to vote for the other side.
Speaking of media and social media, in your opinion, how does the media portrayal of candidates' personality shape voters' perceptions, and do you think social media has changed the way candidates express their personalities to the public?
Social media definitely changes how candidates express themselves. I think this election in particular, we've seen a lot of it with the rise of TikTok more than anything else. You'll have candidates that are trying to appear like normal American people. Yeah. So Tim Walz will go on a TikTok page where he's walking his dog with a guy who has a dog walking TikTok, and there'll be videos of him telling his daughter that turkey is a vegetable in Minnesota. Things like that. These very short, brief interactions that show you a hint of their personality removed from politics. But I'm not sure any of that is going to result in voting. Yeah. I think particularly for this election, because so much that about personalities, especially presidential personalities, is really gendered. And so Kamala Harris, I think, has an uphill battle in this because, I mean, J.D. Vance, within weeks of getting the nomination, called her a childless cat lady, and says that people who are voting for her are childless cat ladies. So personality has become a huge thing already. When she was running for vice president, before she was actually told, yes, you are going to be the vice presidential candidate, when she was amongst lots of other women who were vying for the position, Biden was told not to pick her because she's too ambitious, and she would spend the entire presidency gearing for her own presidential bid as opposed to his. Whereas I'm fairly confident no one told Obama that about Joe Biden, despite the fact that Joe Biden had actively been running for president since like 1988. And so all of these presidential personality traits in this election matter because she's held to a different standard, because people perceive things that she does differently than a male candidate. So if she's called assertive, it's viewed as a criticism. Or if she's called aggressive, it's often viewed as a criticism, whereas people like that about Donald Trump. And I think that's really going to be the big difference here, is it's not presidential personalities as a whole. Her personality, though, is going to be big in this election.
Do you think there's certain personality traits that are more advantageous for a politician or more likely to be forgiven? Perhaps that's to do with gender.
I think both to do with gender and political parties. Yeah. On the whole, all presidents are charismatic in one way or another. They're all assertive. They can all be quite aggressive. Because they have to portray to the American people that they are capable of leading what is a very important country globally, right? The United States is incredibly important, and so whoever leads the United States needs to be able to go against foreign leaders. They need to be able to convince the American public they're doing a good job. They need to be able to convince Congress and the Senate to pass the laws that they want. And so there's elements that always exist in a president. It just depends on how the public perceives those in individual people. So one thing in the 2020 election, in the primaries, there were a number of women that were running, and Elizabeth Warren was one of them. And in Massachusetts, she's known for being incredibly aggressive and incredibly hard-lined. She gets stuff done. That's very much the perception that she wants people to have of her, and it's the one that people vote for her because of. And when she was running in the primary, she really didn't do that on stage in the debates. She took a much softer tone a lot of the time. And I think that hurt her overall, despite the fact that Kamala Harris was more aggressive and got in trouble for it. So it really depends on the individual personality, the individual voter, and how they perceive that. I'm not sure if personality for Donald Trump is going to make a huge difference. People either really like him or they really don't like him. But I think the same is becoming true of Kamala Harris. And it's going to come down to potentially which candidate do you like? Which candidate would you rather rule? Who do you like the least? And why will you vote for the other one because of that?
Right, thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
It's been great hearing from you. All the best to you. And now back to Ben and Jess in the studio, who will be discussing the highlights of the presidential election. Thank you.
Thanks, Klaudia. Last night, the vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance went head-to-head on the debate stage in New York. Tim Walz is Kamala Harris's running mate and the 41st governor of Minnesota, and J.D. Vance is the Republican nominee and senator. They discussed everything from the Middle East crisis, climate change, immigration to abortion. Here to discuss the debate further are my colleagues Jess and Ben, who have the latest from last night. So recently, Israel was hit with Iranian missiles, and this is where the debate started. Ben, what was Walz's comments on the Israel conflict?
So basically, Walz was just very adamant that Israel being able to defend itself was the main priority. He didn't really go much further than that. He then changed tactics to sort of insulting Vance, just talking about how, a lot of Donald Trump's own staff have said that it would be an absolute danger for him to be anywhere near the White House in terms of warfare, and that he is just not the safest pair of hands to deal with what's going on right now in the Middle East.
And what about J.D. Vance? Did he take a different perspective?
I think it's really interesting because one of the things that Walz called out was actually Vance's own kind of words and allegations against Trump's leadership. But I think that he came back to the point which I feel like a lot of Republican rhetoric comes back to, which is the point of a war had not been started within Trump's presidency. And so one of the biggest ideas I think that was circulating at this point was the idea of strong leadership, and this kind of honed it in for Vance, the idea that nothing had actually been started, and he pointed out again that most of the Israel conflict has happened during the Biden-Harris administration.
Yes, totally. What about climate change? I know that's a huge talking point. What do we think, Ben, Waltz's perspective on climate change?
Yeah, so Waltz has obviously knocked Trump for saying that climate change was a hoax, and fact-checked that is true. He did sort of say it was a hoax. He then went on to praise the Biden administration for their Inflation Reduction Act, which has provided billions of dollars to combat climate change. So the Biden administration has been very on climate change. So Waltz obviously was praising that because his running mate Kamala, who he will serve under as vice president, probably is very keen to keep up her reputation as a real warrior for climate change. So criticised Trump and very much praised the Democrats for their Inflation Reduction Act.
Interesting. And did Vance take a little bit more of a hard line
it's
sort of perspective?
It's almost like it felt like he didn't necessarily answer the question. So he came back to the idea that something the Democrat rhetoric had referred to, which is the idea about the carbon emissions being such a rooted, point of where conflict and climate change comes from. And he largely said that if this is something that they want to address, if this is something they want to tackle, that this is largely due to the Biden-Harris administration's work in manufacturing overseas instead of using American farmers or American workers. I think it was quite interesting that Waltz actually negated this by saying that he had spoken to a lot of farmers about, climate change. But Vance, again, made the point that actually a lot of manufacturing comes from places like China and places like the Middle East instead.
Okay. Their next talking point was immigration, and I know that's a massive issue here and the US. What did Waltz have to say about immigration and how they plan on tackling immigration, perhaps the immigration problem?
Yeah, so Waltz very much prodded Vance on the pledge that the Republicans, if they get in office this time around, that they have pledged to implement the largest mass deportation in American history. And then obviously there is a big question as towards if you would separate migrant parents from their American-born children who were born in America. I got confused at which side of the pond we were on.
I know, especially when we're doing, an American politics show.
But everything's so
based in England.
relevant to the UK.
Yeah,
Totally.
absolutely.
What about Vance? What did he have to say on immigration?
I mean, it's quite interesting. The analogy he used is kind of let's start with and let's stop the bleeding, because he spoke about, what the Biden-Harris administration had attempted to do after Trump's presidency, which is essentially, he said, was reversing all of the border policies, and how and he described it as Kamala's wide southern border, and said that it was almost, it's interesting, he related it to the opioid crisis in America, and said that she was allowing fentanyl into the States through this,
Interesting. Well, Kamala has been quite vocal recently about the drug problem in America and immigration, so it is interesting that he sort of probably combated that, I guess.
He did also draw a lot of attention to the fact that the open borders and the lack of restrictions may cause a spike in human trafficking.
Well, it's really interesting because the question the moderator asked, which I thought was a really great question, was the idea, because obviously one of the biggest things that Republican rhetoric is hard on is immigration.
Yes.
She asked whether it was they would be okay separating immigration families from children who were born within the US and their parents who had come illegally as illegal aliens. And kind of what was interesting is that Vance didn't necessarily answer that question, but when he did speak about it, he spoke about how many Americans, many children of Americans have been lost to drug trafficking and sex trafficking, and he largely based this on the fact that there are not tighter restrictions on the border.
Okay,
interesting.
And Waltz did also remark that sort of, the sort of the buzz around, the buzz that the Republicans have created around immigration. The remarks that were made about the Haitian people eating people's pets.
Yeah.
He thinks Waltz has sort of said that in his exact words, this is what happens when you don't want to solve it. When talking about immigration, you demonise it. So he thinks that the Republican strategy is to demonise sort of the immigrants, you know, and instead of really trying to solve the immigration problem, because America, like here in England, it is a huge problem.
Yes. Do we think maybe that was a response, I guess, Waltz's response to the Kamala v. Trump debate, when Trump did compare, you know, for lack of better words, immigrants to, you know, eating cats and dogs? Do we think maybe this was sort of a response to that from the Democrats?
Definitely, 100%. And, you know, it is a huge point of contention that Waltz can pull J.D. Vance up on. So definitely going into this, that would have been one of the points that he would want to go for.
And it was really interesting that he kept like coming back to sort of things I think that Vance was effective in. Is he always referred back to the fact that this idea of like undercutting the American worker.
Yes.
And I thought it was very interesting. He refers back to that when you get into like the cost of living crisis as well. He kind of spoke about how saying that, you know, the job that the American people had given Kamala and that she hadn't effectively done that. A lot of Vance's rhetoric did often refer back to like almost an inertia within the Democratic administration.
Interesting. Well, our final topic, female reproductive rights and abortion. Ben, what can you tell me about Waltz's stance?
Yeah, so obviously Waltz's stance on abortion and female rights is very much over to the left. J.D. Vance is what some people may even take as more right than Donald Trump himself. The Republicans are wanting to take a more hardline, strict approach, cracking down on abortion and lowering the time in which a woman is legally allowed to abort a baby. The Waltz was sort of arguing that it shouldn't be a state-by-state policy, and we shouldn't be letting states sort of control women and what they do with their bodies and when they're able to abort a baby. And obviously the death rates in Texas are higher than a lot of other countries in the world because of abortion mortality. So yeah, the Democrats are definitely sort of
female reproductive rights.
Yeah, and they're really wanting to take an approach to sort of lowering that mortality rate.
What about Vance?
It was quite interesting, actually. I think, and I would say that overall, J.D. Vance came across as quite an articulate speaker, and one of the things he kept referring to was this idea of family values, which I think resonates a lot with the American public at this time. And I think ultimately he didn't necessarily negate some of the things that Waltz was saying, but he came back to this idea, which is kind of a general, often general consensus within the American public of like, you know, the importance of family values, and that's definitely a large thing within the Republican kind of propaganda at the moment, but he didn't necessarily address the question. No.
Yeah, and I just want to put forward before we go, there was sort of this trade-off or this spat that they were having, trying to prove which party or which leader, either would it be Kamala or Donald Trump, which one would be more of a threat to democracy. So the Democrats were really coming at it from the standpoint of when Biden won the election in 2020 and Donald Trump refused to sort of admit that he'd lost the election, and there was that huge uproar in the Capitol, which led to many policemen being injured, and a lot of them did end up killed. So that, from the Democrat point of view, they were, you know, sort of putting forward that makes Donald Trump a huge threat to democracy. J.D. Vance come back with the fact that all of the policing that the Democrats have been doing online with Facebook, Instagram, they've really been cracking down on what people say, censorship. He argued that was a further threat to democracy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much,
guys.
I
just have one more point.
One more final note. Yes,
I completely forgot to add this.
No problem.
One thing I found that was really interesting, referring back to some of the stuff I did with Rosa last week, is that one of the things that I believe it was Waltz that pointed out, is that he said that there was a bill put forward to try and have tighter restrictions on the border, but actually because of the possible Republican kind of influence within the Congress, that was then stopped. And I think that's really interesting that they said it was to do with actually like Trump's ending up his like influence within Congress that ended up stopping that bill. Yeah.
And I do want to say as well about the whole tone of the debate in general. It was very sterile, it was very fair, it was not like the one that we experienced before our general election between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer.
Not as vicious.
They played
No,
very
it
nice, it
wasn't.
weren't
Yes.
vicious, they weren't any personal insults.
No.
But we do have to remember this was only the vice presidential
Yes.
debate, and from a lot of things that I've read, I've heard a lot of other commentators speak, it's not really going to have a big impact, and it never really
Sadly.
does.
Yeah, but also there's not going to be another presidential debate.
Yeah.
There's actually both, well, Trump, I believe, said that he wanted to do another presidential debate, but Kamala has, I think, denied that,
I don't know if watching this debate will have swayed people who want to vote for Trump or people who want to vote for Kamala. I don't know if it will have resulted in a huge change.
Yes, well, I suppose time will only tell if this vice presidential debate was instrumental in the outcome of the election.
I think the only reason why it's been more important this time is because it is so close. The polls are literally neck and neck.
Yes,
So
they
I
are.
think
Right now.
this is why this presidential debate was extra significant because it's a
Yes.
different type of campaign, isn't it?
And especially when, like,
Definitely.
you know, Trump is still so favourable for economics and for, like, that strong leadership and for that idea of, like, a steady hand on it, you know.
Yes, well, both did present themselves very well. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you.
You're
It
very
was
welcome.
an absolute
Our pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had
you,
the best
guys. This week, Ben and I spoke to a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you.
You're
It
very
was
welcome.
an absolute
Our pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had
you,
the best
guys. This week, Ben and I spoke to a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute
Our pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had the
you,
best
guys. This week, a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute
Our pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had the
you,
best
guys. This week, a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you.
You're
It
very
was
welcome.
an absolute
Our
pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had the
you,
best
guys. This week, a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute
Our
pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had the
you,
best
guys. This week, a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute
Our pleasure.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
you had the
you,
best
guys. This week, a couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on to talk to us.
No
about that.
worries,
Thank
yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that is okay. Thank you ever so much, Jess and Ben, for coming on. Thank
Yeah.
you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. did present themselves very well. And I think that, okay, thank you ever Thank you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that, okay, thank you ever Thank you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts and feelings towards Harris and Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that, okay, thank you ever Thank you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that, okay, thank you ever Thank you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts Trump. Let's go to that now. Did present themselves very well. And I think that, okay, thank you ever Thank you. It
You're
was
very welcome.
an absolute couple of locals about their thoughts.
Thanks for that, guys. Now, I spoke to American academic Kate Feld where we discussed voting trends in the past 4 elections. Let's look at that now.
Couple of locals about their thoughts
Well, that's all from us today.
Tune in next week when we look at voter behaviour in rural areas in comparison to urban areas.
From all of us here at 50 Days, I'm Jess Blissitt.
And I'm Ben Cook. Good night.
Well, that's all from us today.
In rural areas in